Hey you guys, this is Britta Alton with Ringgold United Methodist Church. I wanted to share a kids moment with you about our focus for this week in worship. Pastor Chris is going to be talking about David and Goliath. You can look in just about any children's storybook and you will find this story where there is a little David and there's a big bad mean Goliath, and that is one story about David, who lived an incredibly long life, and if you didn't know, sometimes it might feel like his most important story. But there are lots of parts of David's story, and if you think, you've probably heard several. One of the lessons that we've learned about before is David as a young kid being anointed as king, and if you remember, all of his older, bigger brothers were brought before, and God said, no, those are not the right one. But when David came forward, David was the one. Little David. So David, as the smallest, youngest brother, was anointed king. There are stories that tell us about David's musical abilities. He played the lyre, which sounds like a funny name for an instrument, but it's kind of like a flute. It's a little, I don't know, something, and you make music with it, but he sang and he played music. There are also stories about David and his friend Jonathan. There are many stories about David being involved in wars and in being in the wilderness. David was the king of Judah, the king of Israel. There were stories of his kindness with Mephibosheth. There are so many stories. It's important to say the Bible is not a children's storybook. We have lots of children's storybooks that tell stories from the Bible. I asked some of our staff if they would want to share one of their favorite stories about David, and there were, I think I heard crickets in the background, so nobody really wanted to do that. But it's kind of because in addition to all these great stories of all the good things that David did, there's some tricky stories where David did a lot of things that you would call a mess up, or you might need to do that over, or can't even do that over, but you just keep going and you do better and you try to follow God always. I think it's important that we realize that some of our Bible heroes, the people that we look up to and admire, because we do, we look at all of the Psalms that David sang. We look at all of those things and we celebrate who David was, but David was not perfect. You might be looking at the people and leaders in your life. They may not be perfect either, but they will be mightily used by God in lots of ways. Which brings us back to this story that we're focused on this week. You will find this story about David and Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And I'm going to show you some of the verses that you can look up if you want to read them in your actual chapter Bible with your family. You can read through verses 4 through 11, verses 20 through 23, and verses 32 through 39. And those will tell you some of the back and forth arguing that was taking place. What I want you to focus on in this story is not just that the little guy can win against the big guy. That would be missing the point. So I'm gonna point out to you, if you don't already know, there's a little worship activity bag for those that worship in person, and there's worship bingo and some bulletins that go along with the theme each week in there, and some other activities. And this week, in your worship activity bag, I included a cotton ball and a tiny little pebble. And so if you threw the cotton ball or the pebble, which I won't throw at the camera, if you threw those at me, would you be able to knock me over? Probably not, right? And if you read those verses with your family, you'll see that that is what David was depending upon, that it was not going to be his power or strength. It is God's power that is stronger than the power of humans. I'm going to take a second. I'm going to say that again. God's power is stronger than the power of humans. Even against giants, God's power is stronger. And so it is oftentimes just with God's help that we manage to make it through a particular struggle or trial. So I hope you hear that this week. The fact that David is not perfect helps you to recognize how much you can be used by God if you rely on that strength that is from God and not your own. I don't like it when all of a sudden I say something and I realize that's something that I need to preach to myself. Sometimes that happens. That'll happen in your life too. I am praying for your well-being, and until I see you again, I pray that you are blessed. Bye.